we might just go to that now. And as an example, Adam Tooze himself is an example because he's recently disclosed that he's not just studying China; he's actually learning Chinese in his, I think he's in his 50s. Adam, if you're watching, you have an open invitation to join me here on the Burning Archive. But so again, it's just that sort of sense of a different kind of participation with the cultures of the world, rather than just sort of studying it from the libraries of the West, actually engaging and participating in the language and the culture of different cultures. And I mean, you've written a piece recently, I think, on for Global Times about China's Global Civilizations Initiative, and more broadly, just the concept of there's a lot of talk about in Western media, in YouTube channels, Jordan Peterson, that Konstantin Kishin, I think his name is, John Anderson in Australia, Tony Abbott, all these kind of people who like to talk about the superiority of Western civilization. But quite a few countries are now really asserting themselves as civilization states, and I guess demanding respect, let's say, for different cultural framings of the world as it exists culturally, but also politically, economically, socially as well. So, what are your thoughts about this Global Civilizations Initiative of China and the scope for increased dialogue between civilizations, which is a very loaded term, has a lot of different meanings over time, but it is, I think, it's a handle people use to describe, I guess, cultural diversity around the world.
Yeah. As you mentioned, a couple of years ago, China launched what they call the Global Civilization Initiative as part of a three-pronged intervention or a statement of vision or a framework. So we have the Civilization Initiative, we have the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Development Initiative. And in some respects, those three initiatives form three parts of a combined story or framework. The civilizational dialogue question, I guess, is going to become more pressing because the mono dialogue, if you will, of a singular linear European developmental story is now no longer sustainable. That was a story that came along together with the progressive conquest of the non-European world by European powers during the last 500 years. And it came part and parcel with a particular regime of thought that ordered the world. And that regime of thought, I guess I have loosely called it a form of colonial liberalism. Now, liberalism, of course, is a very broad term. It can mean many different things. But my sense of what colonial liberalism relates to is a particular way in which the individual is conceptualized and how that conceptualization of the individual is nestled into a broader metaphysical and normative framework about human advancement. And the idea here is that the individual, as an individual, becomes more free and less susceptible to the pulls and pushes of the collective environment and to superstition and mythology, is symbolic of the unfolding of civilization. And you can find these broad ideas in the German idealist tradition, going back through Hegel and Kant. And you can also find elements of it in the ways that John Locke and John Stuart Mill and other colonial administrators actually spoke of what animated their focus on what it was to be civilized. So civilized and civilization also came with some loaded ideas, namely that it spoke to something that was good, as opposed to the barbaric, and that what was good, what was civilized, was the unfolding of individual freedom, that could only happen in the context of the unfolding of of European ideas. And these European ideas were largely ones that were associated with um, elements of religious thinking, actually, in German Protestantism, particularly the metaphysical variety that came through Kant and Leibniz and Hegel, as opposed to a very different strand, by the way, of German philosophy of the 1600s, which was through guys like Samuel Pufendorf and Christian Thomasius. But we also find some of it in the British tradition as well. And that sense of the unfolding of this singular history played a very dominant role, often backed up by the economic and military power of the colonial states at the time. But that's not sustainable, as I said. And so we're confronting another dimension of the empire's abyss, and that is that its narrative frame, the mental model of how the world works, is no longer reflective of its former sort of ideological and narrative ambitions. Now, what China is doing, and China's not the only civilization state that is in many ways asserting its own historical experience. You find it in the Islamic world, Iran, you're finding it in Russia, through the Orthodox Church, but also a much broader sense of Russianness. And of course, we see it in the cosmologies of many indigenous peoples from all the different continents of the world. They are saying that, in fact, there is not one single path of human history, but that, in fact, people and places through time have their own experiences and their own histories. And what we now need is, rather than a process by which we divide up civilizations between the civilized and the barbaric, we actually now need, in the name of coexistence and peace, a re-engagement with the prospects of genuine diversity. And that's what the Civilization Initiative, I think, is seeking to do. Whether it's going to succeed or not will, of course, depend upon its dialogue partners. Right? Dialogue is, by definition, involves more than one. And we are starting to see the emergence, as I mentioned, of attempts in the West as well as elsewhere to bring a different cosmology to the table, to, in many ways, assert the relevance of the experiences of non-Western peoples, part of the human experience. So there is still something common. It's called the human experience, but the human experience is rich in its diversity. And how it is now that we can find genuinely meaningful points of engagement that go beyond the sort of tick the box multicultural stuff, right? So we've got to get beyond the fact that we enjoy eating food from many places, as enjoyable as that is, to a point where we can have a much deeper and richer dialogue about what it is to be a person, what it is to be an individual, what it is to be a community, a society, and how does that kind of work? What do we mean by being, having the good life or a good life? How do we arrive at judgments about conduct that aren't reducible to the sort of universal imperatives of, say, Kant, the Kantian ethical frame, but to a much more fluid and nuanced ethical frame that we find resonance in the Confucian space, but also in the pre-Kantian ethical space, whether it's going back to the Greek classics, Aristotle and others, and those ideas around virtue ethics. So what is it to be a person, right? And how to be a good person, right? I mean, these things are all now, I think, back on the table, whereas 20 years ago, we basically had a political discourse that literally just said, well, liberalism won, that's it, this is how it's going to be, there's no such thing as society, Homo economicus is it, get used to it. And that's all unfolding. That's not happening.
Yeah. And that's sort of been layered over and sort of reanimated, if you like, some very deep traditions in historical thought, I guess, through the 20th century about civilizations as well. I mean, I've been very deeply influenced over time by the historian Felipe Fernandez Amesto, who wrote a great book on civilizations, where he emphasized particularly, you can't treat civilization as a checklist, as having this quality, because there are so many different varieties and they don't always look like that. And also to distinguish civilization, to avoid the mistake of comparing civilization with barbarism, which is just us versus them sort of mistake, or to confuse civilization with progress. Again, that things don't necessarily grow in a linear way, and I do notice there's a lot of a sort of a reactivation of a lot of those sort of concepts in the discussion around civilizations and civilization states at the moment. I noticed Alexander Dugin said some wacky things the other day, yet again, about, he said America had to become a civilization state if MAGA is to fulfill its the promise that Alexander saw in it, which and I've sort of made a commitment to write something about that as well, and I might do some videos on the channel. But what you say, I think, is also reflected, for example, in the books written by Dr. S.J. Shankar, the Indian External Affairs Minister, who talks explicitly about how the cultural traditions and statecraft traditions of India frame its perception of the multipolar world in a way that's it's not so evident, I guess, in the binary kind of thinking, I guess, of a lot of Western international relations sort of scholarship. But I wanted to ask you about a possible test for China's civilizations initiative, a test of its rhetoric, perhaps, on civilizations, and that's the perhaps emerging dispute with India. And this is a dimension of the changing multipolar world that it's not all about the world's relationships with the United States; it's the relationships of other great powers with each other. But the issue over the reincarnation or the succession of the Dalai Lama, which seems to be playing a little bit into, I guess, perceptions of cultural value in India, China, or political concepts in India, China. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that issue, or more broadly, I guess, how India and China are actually sort of managing their relationship at the current moment? Because there have been, strains in that relationship, which is pretty critical for how the world develops.
Yeah, look, the India-China question, I think, deserves another program. So I'll probably leave that.
Just make this a quick one at the end. Yeah.
Look, on the question of the Dalai Lama, I tend to take a little bit of a diffident "so what" perspective, which is anchored by, I guess, a much more materialist view of this artifact, what is in effect a political artifact called the Dalai Lama.
Mm.
I know this will be a little bit controversial for some people, but people need to come to grips with the fact of what the so-called Buddhist theocracy actually was like, and there was nothing good about it in terms of the quality of life of people on the Tibetan plateaus at the time. There was not much good about it in terms of the prospects of young girls getting an education. There were none. For young boys getting an education, there was none unless you went into the monastery. There was persistent indentured slavery and feudalism, etc., etc. The idea that some guy can conjure up through divine intervention his successor is in my view an absolute nonsense. But of course it has political effect, right? So the political effect is that it becomes a focal point of, once again, the conflicting narratives and perspectives and interests of a number of powers now, right? So, of course, the artifact of the Dalai Lama has become Hollywoodized and as some symbolic, figure of, all things good and nice, which is detached from the history of the Buddhist theocracy, but also, of course, it plays into a particular set of geopolitical discursive interventions, which seeks to cultivate ferment in particular localities, and we see the same again, right? So, how this gets resolved, well, I suspect that we'll end up with a Chinese view of who the successor is, and we'll end up with a Dalai Lama view of who his successor is, and it will be a sort of a festering pest, sore, because in a sense it has been set up to be a festering sore, and until the broader geopolitical questions are ultimately resolved, it will remain, this sort of fluid and unstable point. The last thing I'll say is that, in the 1950s, the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, when he was much younger, was incredibly welcoming of Mao and the Communist Party. He just changed his tune a little bit later on, and perhaps I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Of course, he's probably not the only person who's changed their opinions since the 1950s. But it would be a fascinating question to ask. I have seen a number of Indian programs discuss the quite likely possibility that there'll be sort of two Dalai Lamas for a while, which perhaps is not so different to whatever it was, 14th century Europe, where I think at some point there were three popes, so let alone the head of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople.
The more the merrier.
Yeah, the more the merrier, indeed. So, but I do think it's going to be an interesting thing, and it'd be great to have another chat with you another time, Warwick, about the India-China relationship, because there were reports about a thaw and reports about the end of a thaw, and all sorts of things going on in the multinational media on this particular issue. So it would be really
perhaps on that question,
thoughts.
Jeff, and it's not the only one, but perhaps as a methodological point, often people focus on bilateral relationships in isolation from the broader context, right? And as you've always emphasized, that bigger historical picture makes a difference, of course, but how two parties relate to each other is sometimes seriously affected by how they relate to a third or fourth party. And my own sense is that the China-India relationship is not just a bilateral relationship, but it is shaped in many ways by the ways in which particularly the Americans treat India. I think they are a little bit more economically vulnerable still to American pressure than, say, China is.
Mm.
And also, I think that there is a little bit of, if you hedge by leaving the door open to the Americans, then part of the price you pay is of course that you'll be pulled along as well. So that's the double-edged sword of hedging.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, and consistent with our theme, there's a lot of discussion in the Indian media, in the sort of Indian geopolitics sort of commentary channel at the moment about how America, they've had a difficult relationship with America over a long period of time that had been improving, but their general sense is it's got worse over the last 6 months or so. And notwithstanding trade deals and all that sort of thing, but what the Indian commentators refer to as the hyphenation of India and Pakistan by Donald Trump was a particularly infuriating diplomatic faux pas. So interesting times. We'll have to talk about that another time. When you walk through Angkor Wat and the ruins of that great Khmer civilization in the jungle, it makes you wonder, what is a civilization? You might also wonder, what makes a civilization collapse and become stone ruins in a jungle, overtaken by the jungle, by the environment? And are there other civilizations that are more enduring, more successful, less likely to collapse, that might even be a foundation for a global civilization, or the end of history, like some imagine Western civilization to be?